It's April 1865. The Civil War, this brutal, bloody conflict that just ripped the United States in two, is finally over. The Union has won. And just as the nation is starting to take its first real breath of relief, one single gunshot is about to send it spiraling back into chaos and grief, changing American history forever.
You can just feel the shock in those words, can't you? That feeling that rippled across the entire country. So, to really get how we got to this point, we've got to go back. We have to unravel the conspiracy that was brewing right under everyone's noses.
At the very heart of this conspiracy was a man who, and this is key, was one of the most famous people in America at the time. A celebrity, really. And he planned to use that fame and access for something absolutely devastating.
Right, so John Wilkes Booth, he was basically a 19th century movie star. He was handsome, charismatic, a superstar of the stage, but underneath all that, he was a diehard Confederate sympathizer. And as the South started to lose the war, his passion just festered into pure fanaticism. But his first plan, it wasn't actually murder. It was something almost crazier. This right here shows you just how far he spiraled. The first idea was to kidnap Lincoln. They spent 6 months planning it. But on the day they were going to do it, Lincoln, just by pure chance, changed his schedule. The plot was a total bust. So when Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell a few weeks later, Booth's desperation just boiled over. The plan wasn't about kidnapping anymore. It was about killing. And the new plan was, well, it was breathtakingly ambitious. The idea was to completely decapitate the U.S. government in a single night. Booth would handle Lincoln himself. His associate, Lewis Powell, was assigned to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, and another guy, George Atzerodt, was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. This wasn't just revenge. It was this desperate, last-ditch fantasy that maybe, just maybe, this much chaos could actually bring the Confederacy back from the dead. So the night is April 14th. It's Good Friday. Washington, D.C. is in party mode. Over at Ford's Theater, a popular comedy called Our American Cousin is playing to a full house. And who's in the audience? The president himself, sitting up in his private box, laughing along with everyone else. But just outside, the dark machinery of Booth's plot was clicking into place.
It happened so fast. At 10:15 p.m., Booth knew the play by heart. He waited for a big laugh line to mask the sound of the door opening. He fired one shot, stabbed an officer who tried to stop him, and then made this dramatic leap down to the stage. He actually broke his leg in the fall, but still managed to shout, "Sic semper tyrannis!" That's "thus ever to tyrants," before disappearing out the back door.
For a split second, people in the audience were just confused. They thought, maybe this is part of the play? But then they heard Mary Lincoln's piercing scream, and pure pandemonium just erupted. As this eyewitness says, the whole theater just switched from a place of laughter to one of pure rage and helpless despair. But here's the thing. Booth's grand, chaotic plot was already falling apart. Lewis Powell's attack on Secretary Seward was brutal, but Seward, incredibly, survived. And George Atzerodt, he completely lost his nerve, chickened out, and just got drunk at a hotel bar instead. Only the main part of the plot worked. Lincoln was carried across the street, and he died the next morning. And with that, the chase began. The moment Lincoln took his final breath, the country plunged into grief. But that grief very quickly turned into a white-hot desire for justice. What followed was one of the biggest, most intense manhunts in American history. 10,000. Just think about that number, 10,000 men. The entire military machine that had just won the Civil War was now pointed at finding one single person. John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor, was now officially the most wanted man in America. Now, Booth wasn't totally on his own. He and an accomplice, David Harold, found their way to the home of a Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd, who was a Confederate sympathizer, set Booth's broken leg, and that act of aid would eventually land him in prison. And by the way, that old saying, "your name is Mudd," totally unrelated. It had been around for decades before any of this happened. The manhunt was absolutely relentless. Booth, a guy used to five-star hotels and adoring fans, was now basically living like a cornered animal. He kept this small diary during his escape, and his words just paint this vivid picture of a man who is cold, starving, and totally terrified as he feels that net closing in.
And here's where it gets really interesting. As Booth is on the run, he's reading the newspapers, and he's just horrified. He thought he'd be seen as a hero, a modern-day Brutus who saved their republic. Instead, everyone, North and South, was calling him a common cutthroat. His diary shows this complete and total delusion. In his mind, he's a noble martyr. To the rest of the world, he's just a killer.
So after 12 long days, the chase finally ends at a tobacco barn in Virginia. Union troops have it completely surrounded. Booth's accomplice, David Harold, he gives up pretty quickly. But Booth, ever the actor, he was determined to have a dramatic final scene. He was not going to be taken alive. The soldiers lit the barn on fire to flush him out. In the chaos, a sergeant shot Booth through the neck. They dragged him out of the burning building, paralyzed. After a few hours, they say he asked to see his hands and whispered his last words, "Useless, useless." A pretty pathetic end for a man who thought he was changing history for the better.
Okay, so the main actor in this whole tragedy is dead. Now the government turns its attention to the supporting cast. The hunt was now on for every single person who played a part, no matter how small they thought it was.
A military trial was set up. And let me tell you, justice was swift and it was harsh. David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt, all sentenced to death. Dr. Mudd, who set Booth's leg, got a life sentence. But the fate of one other person on this list would become the most controversial of them all. Mary Surratt. She ran the boarding house where the conspirators met up. She was also sentenced to hang. Now, this was a huge deal. A lot of people, even some of the judges, assumed she'd get a last-minute pardon because the U.S. government had never executed a woman before. But that pardon never came. On July 7, 1865, she was hanged with the others. In fact, Lewis Powell, right before he was executed, shouted from the gallows that she was innocent. The assassination did way more than just kill a president. It completely changed his place in the American story. It was the last tragic act that really transformed Abraham Lincoln from a man into a legend. The grief that swept the nation was just unprecedented. They put Lincoln's body on a special funeral train that traveled almost 1,700 miles, retracing the journey he took to Washington when he first became president. For 3 weeks, hundreds of thousands of people lined the tracks just to get a glimpse, to pay their respects. It really cemented this image of him as a national martyr. But here's the really important question to ask. Did his death turn a controversial, often hated president into a saint overnight? It's so easy to forget now, but before he was killed, a lot of people in the North and the South could not stand Abraham Lincoln. But in death, he became something else entirely. And maybe the most clear-eyed take on this comes from the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Years later, he gave this incredibly honest and complex view. He gave Lincoln full credit for saving the Union and ending slavery, but he also refused to sugarcoat history. He reminded people that Lincoln was still a man of his time, often held back by the prejudices that were common among white Americans. Douglass saw the whole person, not just the myth. And we're going to end on one last, totally bizarre twist. In 1876, a group of counterfeiters actually tried to break into Lincoln's tomb and steal his body to hold it for ransom. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The plot failed, but it's such a strange and weirdly fitting final note. It just reminds us that the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, the man, the president, the martyr, was and still is an incredibly complex, contested, and just endlessly fascinating part of the American story.